If Dante had been with us, he would have been terrified. The city we'd seen so clearly in the sunlight was now an ugly smudge. Paul Tibbets, Mission Hiroshima.
There was a big flash in the sky over Hiroshima, as if someone had flashed a camera right in front of my eyes. I was dazzled. We felt a shock wave all the way through our bodies. I saw a cloud of smoke rise up between the two mountains, as if a volcano had just erupted. Something had just happened to Hiroshima. It was mayhem. Screams were coming from everywhere. We realized that it was something very, very serious.
While the first atomic bomb in history dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, will forever remain the most spectacular act of war of the 20th century, the story began 3 years earlier in France, in the Normandy sky over the city of Rouen.
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock.
8 men still in that B-17.
Under German occupation since June 1940, France has already suffered numerous air raids from British planes. But these take place at night and often miss their target. In the summer of 1942, the Americans, already at war in the Pacific with the Japanese, inaugurate their arrival in the European skies. They're testing out a new strategy.
I was on holiday in Dieppe. We saw a group of planes fly over us, followed by a second one. There were 2 groups of 6 planes in all. Shortly afterwards, we saw the same planes flying back in the opposite direction. One of us said, "They didn't go very far." Nothing else unusual happened that day. The only thing is that in the interval between these 2 events, we became orphans.
Jean-Pierre and Jean-Paul are just children, but this August the 17th, 1942 will change their lives forever.
We heard the sounds of the planes and the air raid siren at practically the same time. Then a few moments later, the bombs started dropping. It was almost simultaneous.
Pratiquement simultané.
Normally, we received a warning alert before an air raid, sometimes for nothing, but we were nonetheless warned in advance, whereas this came totally out of the blue.
I feel as if I've witnessed death without actually having seen it.
I saw this piece of metal appear like that, and then a big white glow.
My mother's brains were all over the slab in the morgue. They found her leg, her thigh, in a tree.
My sister got hit by 3 pieces of shrapnel, one in the heart, one in the head, and the third one, I don't remember, but 2 of them were fatal anyway, and they must have passed right over my head and at the side of me. We blamed the war in general. We blamed the Americans, the English, the Germans. We blamed everybody because it destroyed our childhood.
Even today, Rouen still remembers the innocent victims of this fine summer's day. 53 civilians and national railway line workers are killed and 120 injured. A specialist in World War II bombings and air raids, the Rouen-born historian Paul Le Trevier returns to the Sotteville marshalling yard, where it all began.
We're at the Sotteville-les-Rouen marshalling yard. This yard was the target of the August 17, 1942 air raid, the first American bombing raid on occupied Europe. This marshalling yard is one of the major railway hubs of Western France. It handles all connections to Normandy, as well as to northern France, from the Somme to Lille. On this August 17, 1942, this yard is going to be the target of the very first American bombs dropped on occupied Europe. Behind me is the city of Rouen, and that's where the planes arrived from, more or less in this direction. The planes reached Dieppe on the French coast at about 5 p.m., 5:10. They reach their target without encountering any obstruction and are able to launch their raid between 5:29 and 5:39 p.m. So in the space of just 10 minutes, the 12 planes are going to drop 54 bombs on the target, but also, as we know, on the city of Rouen and its suburb Sotteville. Rouen is taken totally by surprise. It's the first time a plane has attacked in daylight like this. The sirens go off at almost the same time as the first bombs are dropped. Following the raid, a press conference is held. The Americans are going to explain what happened to the 30 or so journalists and war correspondents present. The explanation is given by the commander of the 8th Air Force, General Acre.
Commanding the Bomber Command, led this flight, and he may like to say a few words.
Our target was a marshalling yard and a roundhouse for the repair of locomotives. A very large one and a very important one to the German effort.
La conférence est un succès.
The press conference is a success. It's quite brief. It's filmed. The next morning, the British and American media described the raid as a great success. The American concept of air warfare is entirely valid, and they managed to convince public opinion, and by the same token, the politicians, and primarily President Roosevelt, who from that moment on is going to approve the widespread application of high-altitude precision daylight bombing operations.
Already severely hit, Rouen and its suburbs have just lived through its darkest moment. Buildings in ruins, dead bodies. In the Church of Our Lady of the Assumption in Sotteville-les-Rouen, a simple and reverential funeral service is held for the railway worker victims of the British bombing raid.
So in France, in Rouen, in the Vichyist press, to put it simply, this attack is largely going to be reported through the voice of propaganda. First of all, the newspapers are going to adopt a rather unusual approach. They're going to say, it's the British, it's the Royal Air Force that attacked us. Why do they do this? The answer is very simple. It's in order to put off, as long as possible, announcing the entry into war of the Americans on the territory of occupied Europe. Rouen wasn't chosen by chance. During the First World War, it's here where the British soldiers landed. It's here where the technical resources and supplies arrived. It's also here where American troops landed in 1917 to carry out their campaign. So this port of Rouen became France's leading port during World War I. And because of its importance, it'll become known to all, to the British public, to the American public. When you hit Rouen, you awaken public opinion. You know your message is going to get through.
Rouen is an easy target. You can jokingly say all you have to do is go over to English Channel, find the river, follow the river down, and you can't miss it. You know, it's the first big city on the left.
Only a small quantity of planes will be used for this bombing raid. Just 12 B-17s. One man is going to distinguish himself and will go on to have a very singular destiny during the war. This man is Paul Tibbets, who pilots the lead B-17 that day and carries out his first war mission. He'll continue with this bomber group to carry out other operations over occupied France and then in Africa. And from 1943, Paul Tibbets is going to help develop the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. And it's he, finally, who on August 6, 1945, is going to lead the raid on Hiroshima.
Paul Tibbets is just a young 24-year-old pilot when he leads the bombing raid on Rouen. His grandson, Paul Tibbets IV, is also a bomber pilot. Like his grandfather, he's been trained to use atomic weapons. He's now a brigadier general and deputy director for nuclear operations at the United States Strategic Command. He remembers conversations with his grandfather.
My grandfather spoke quite often about World War II. He particularly spoke about the honor it was to lead B-17 formations, B-17 flights during the early part of the war. We talked about this raid on Rouen. He says, Paul, we knew that this was a very important raid, a very important mission for Americans. But we also knew that after this mission, we got to go back and tweak our procedures, our tactics, our techniques and procedures. We need to work those to make sure our bombs can be even more accurate the next time.
This mission on Rouen, of which I was the leader, was a small beginning for us, but the beginning of the end for Hitler. As pilot of the lead plane on the first raid, I was very much aware that we had to prove our accuracy at high altitude. The Americans' objective and strategy is to take the war to the enemy, Germany. But in order to be validated, this new modern-style warfare needed new tools, the development of new technologies and improved efficiency.
If we do a successful job, the progress of the war is going to be improved a very great deal.
The first step was it proved that we could bomb a target in daylight and come home. The fact is the airmen all wanted the same general thing. They wanted to take the war to Germany.
The Americans are going to devise a bombing strategy based on 3 pillars. The first of these is daylight bombing. The second is to bomb at high altitude in order to be out of range of anti-aircraft guns. And the third pillar, decisive for them, is precision bombing. So, put together, this gives daylight, high-altitude precision bombing.
Officers and crews spill out of the briefing hut and head for their planes. The mission has begun.
It's an absolutely modern war. They absolutely must keep the American public and the American politician entertained. And they have to understand that the American soldiers and airmen are doing their part in the war, and that they're not wantonly killing.
Achtung, Achtung. Luftklare Meldung vom Divisionsgefechtsstand.
While the Germans still controlled the territory on the ground, they now have to learn to live under the bombs. Their anti-aircraft defenses are overwhelmed by the increasingly massive and efficient Allied air attacks. A new war begins. We see the birth of what are known as surgical strikes.
Army Air Corps and then the Air Force, they want precision. They want to be as precise, do not want to be seen as wantonly killing, and so it's important that the news media are providing the message that is proper. We are doing precision bombing, we are hitting targets, we are destroying the German war machine. It had to be precise because that's what they believed would bring the war to an end. They wanted to be precise because the American public would not tolerate lots of casualties. The mission reports are always bombs in the target area. They always talk about how many bombs are in the target area. They don't report what percentage of the bombs are outside the target area or where they went.
In order for their daylight bombing campaign to be successful, the Americans employ a tool that guarantees them unprecedented accuracy, the Norden bomb sight.
The Norden bomb sight tries to compensate mechanically for so many different factors. The speed of the airplane, the height of the airplane, the temperature of outside, the wind speed, the bomber's eyesight, weight of the bombs, the wind speeds on the ground, and the cant, or the tilt of the airplane.
There was a claim going around at the time, no doubt started by the manufacturer himself, that with the Norden bomb sight you could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 10,000 feet. But this is more a fancy of the mind than reality.
Pilot left waist gunner. We're over the IP. Release fires. Waist gunner to pilot. Bombs away. Bombs away.
During the first years of the war, the targets are essentially military objectives: a factory, an aerodrome, a railway hub, communication routes. All very precise, well-identified targets. But as the war progresses, they're going to realize that the factories are often located in populated zones, that a particular railway hub is also located close to a large town or metropolis. So, little by little, the line's going to become more and more blurred between the military targets they want to hit and the civilian zones that become the inevitable victims of the increasingly massive campaign of destruction that's going to take place. During the last years of the war, they're going to tell themselves that this destruction of military targets surrounded by civilian zones isn't a bad thing. The idea is to lower the morale of the German population. So they say, we're going to take care of the military targets that interest us, but if we partially or even totally destroy some German cities at the same time, well, it's not really a problem, because by doing this, we hope to destroy the German population's confidence in this Third Reich, which we know is doomed for destruction. So, this is the mindset behind the bombing raids of the last years of the war.
This is industrial warfare at its best, or worst. Massive amounts of equipment. On June 6, 1944, there were 14,000 aircraft in the sky. That's an amazing number. I don't think all the nations in the world today could put 14,000 combat aircraft in the sky at one time.
This is the proud new weapon of the United States Army Air Forces. But it is our plane, too, because we, the people, built it. We conceived it, financed it, gave it wings. We powered it and armed it, and our sons and brothers fly it.
What's important is the whole industrial and technological approach. The B-29 Superfortress, for example, is a result of this expertise, of this experience obtained in the European theatre with a plane, the B-29, that's going to enable flying at an even higher altitude, 30,000 feet. A plane that's going to be pressurised, well defended, and which in terms of autonomy is going to enable raids much deeper inside enemy territory. Paul Tibbets is going to play a very essential role because of his experience in the European theatre. He's going to be given the mission of developing this new plane.
They were having troubles with the B-29, engineering problems with the B-29. They actually lost the lead test pilot in a crash. So as my grandfather was working with Boeing, working with the engineers for operationalizing, if we can call it that, the B-29, one of the problems that they knew about was the engines overheating, problems with the engines themselves, and how they were going to get the airplane to higher altitudes to be able to fly bombing missions in the war. So one of the things that my grandfather and the crew worked out together was, hey, what if we lighten the airplane yeah, there's some vulnerability in doing that, but let's try lightening the airplane, making it not as heavy, and see what kind of performance we get out of it.
Paul Tibbets' idea is this. I'll take off some of the armouring, remove some of the heavy machine guns, and with this lighter weight, I can fly even higher and be out of range of the anti-aircraft guns and even of the Japanese fighter planes, which can't go as high as the B-29 is able to.
2 fighters, 6 o'clock up, coming in. Diver now, Chief. Got an engine on fire.
My grandfather had a passion for aviation. It's really all he wanted to do. From the time that he was about 12 years old, he was actually given the opportunity to ride in a barnstorming airplane and drop out Baby Ruth candy bars, brand new candy bar with little tiny parachutes on them, over an event, a sporting event, in his hometown. He was hooked. He said, aviation, this is what I want to do. When he got to the point in college where he had to go to medical school, he dropped out and went to aviation cadet school and let his father know that that was his dream and that's what he wanted to do. And his father said, well, son, I wish you luck with that. But he was very upset about it because that's what he wanted. He wanted him to be a doctor. That was the plan. And his mother said, Paul, your father is upset. He doesn't like this decision. He wants you to be a doctor. I want you to do what you want to do. You work hard at it, and I know you'll be successful. And so if we fast forward a few years, he decided to name the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. He named that plane after his mother because she was the one that encouraged him to pursue his dreams.
In 1943, Paul Tibbets begins developing the largest bomber plane ever built, the B-29 Super Fortress, the only plane capable of transporting this new weapon of which we still know nothing. Its design is kept top secret and the engineers who work on it are locked away inside ultra-guarded facilities. Commissioned by President Roosevelt, this secret operation has a name: the Manhattan Project. The purpose of this unparalleled future powerful weapon is to put an end to the conflict, but also to dissuade America's enemies from entering into war with it.
Once they figure out that a weapon is starting to be developed, then they go ahead and they start to figure out how to deliver it and what that's going to look like. And you can only imagine the problems of how do we do that, what's it look like, how do you detonate the nuclear weapon inside the bomb, and that's why you put together a very special bombing group under Tibbets.
On June 6, 1944, the Allies land on the Normandy beaches and begin liberating France. The bombing raids on Germany are stepped up in order to precipitate the fall of Hitler and the capitulation of the Third Reich. The mass bombing will reach its peak in February 1945 in Dresden. The town is completely annihilated, destroyed. This strategy, coupled with the Soviet spectacular advance on the Eastern Front, leads to Hitler's suicide and the surrender of Nazi Germany on May 8, 1945. It's the end of the war in Europe. But it doesn't mean that the Second World War is all over. It continues on in Asia and in the Pacific, where the Japanese, allies of Nazi Germany, don't surrender and continue to spread terror.
Well, Europe entered into war in 1939. Japan had started to invade China 2 years earlier. And the Japanese army already controlled a large part of its territory. Japan's entry into war with England and the United States was primarily motivated by its desire to appropriate the resources in Southeast Asia. And particularly the oil resources of Sumatra, Borneo, and Kalimantan in present-day Indonesia.
4 years after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans are intent on revenge. They repatriate their bomber planes and crews from Europe to the Pacific in order to continue the bombing strategy that had proved so successful in Germany. Thanks to its unsurpassed autonomy, the B-29 now enables them to organize air attacks from their rear bases in the middle of the Pacific, in the Mariana Islands. They can thus carry out raids on Japan and massively bomb its major cities.
Destination, Tokyo.
In May 1945, during the surrender of Germany, Japan was in the middle of the fierce Battle of Okinawa. The Americans had landed on Okinawa Island in March 1945, and the extremely brutal combats raged on into the month of June.
Smashing through powerful enemy fortifications, American troops battle their way forward on Okinawa Island, key stepping stone to Japan.
The noose is tightening around Japan, and the Allies are moving closer and closer to the heart of the empire of the rising sun. The battles that take place on the island of Iwo Jima, then on Okinawa, will be two of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War. The Americans end up conquering and occupying the southern islands, but lose 20,000 soldiers at Iwo Jima and 40,000 at Okinawa. With the conquest of these islands, it's the return to conventional warfare with heavy losses. The American public opinion can no longer tolerate it. A solution has to be found, and just as in Europe, it will come from the sky.
The Japanese strategists predicted that after Okinawa, the Allied forces were going to land on Japan's major island, Honshu. Japan's war plan was therefore to inflict the maximum of losses on the Allied forces once they'd landed on the island of Honshu. So they prepared for what they named the decisive battle, the great final battle. To win this battle, several conditions were necessary. The first and most important of these was that the Soviet Union remain neutral in this conflict. Because at this stage of the war, the Soviets were fighting Germany, but not yet Japan.
From the month of April 1945, Japan notified the Soviets that it wanted to negotiate a settlement to end the war with the Allied forces, and particularly with the United States. The land forces wanted to continue the combat, but the Navy wanted to end it. So, despite opposition from the land forces, a part of the government, together with Emperor Hirohito, agreed to end the conflict. However, there was no question of an unconditional surrender. Preserving the imperial system was of primordial importance and at the center of the negotiations. The emperor didn't want to be tried by a war crimes tribunal, obviously.
July 1945. While the Japanese attempt to negotiate an honorable way out of the war, the first nuclear weapon tests by the Americans prove successful. At the same time, the American President Harry Truman goes to Germany to attend the Potsdam Conference with all the other leaders of the major Allied powers. His main objective is to obtain Stalin's support against Japan.
The Potsdam Conference is held just outside Berlin from mid-July until August the 2nd. The Allied leaders issue a proclamation demanding unconditional surrender from the Japanese government, which Japan refuses.
Here, the fate of Germany and the end of Japanese aggression will be settled.
We want peace and prosperity for the world as a whole.
At the beginning, the United States didn't think they'd win this conflict without the participation of the Soviet Union. So they put a lot of pressure on the Soviets to obtain their support and participation. But for the Americans, if the nuclear tests proved successful, the participation of the Soviet Union in this conflict was no longer a decisive factor.
The future of the planet is decided here in Potsdam, where President Truman learns that the atomic weapon tests are conclusive. News that puts a smile on his face, which Stalin doesn't understand, because contrary to appearances, a whiff of the Cold War floats over the meeting. Stalin, who makes no secret of his expansionist ambitions, declares war on Japan. He sees this as an opportunity to expand his territory in Asia. He covets Sakhalin Island, Manchuria, and who knows, even farther away, maybe even Japan, where he already sees himself in his dreams. As the Soviets start preparing themselves and assembling troops at the Manchurian border, Truman realizes that he can't trust them and has to curb his ambitions.
The Japanese didn't know this, but for the Americans, the Potsdam Agreement was the final warning before the atomic bombing.
I'm a firm believer that once the Russians entered the war was over. It may have taken another couple of weeks, maybe a month. With or without an atom bomb, I think that war was over.
Once the Soviets entered the war, the Americans wanted to show the world the extent of their military power and dampen the ambitions of the Soviet Union.
The Japanese were prepared to defend down in the southeast, and they were ready to go. They were ready to fight us to their death.
The Japanese military forces no longer had the necessary means to continue fighting. The Navy had been destroyed, and the Air Force was considerably weakened. It was no longer possible to build fighter planes and correctly train pilots and carry out test flights, all because of a lack of fuel, kerosene. Having only pilots with little training and no flying experience, Japan decided to use them in suicide attacks, kamikaze attacks, with planes packed with explosives aimed directly at the enemy boats. I think the strategy must have scared the enemy at first. But if we look at the situation objectively, we can't really say that it was successful. What it did do, though, was show the Allied forces and the whole world that the Japanese fighting spirit went beyond rational considerations.
Brought to their knees, the Japanese play their last card. The kamikaze attacks appear as a valiant last stand. For 1,500 kamikaze missions, 100 or so American boats are hit and 47 sunk. Over 5,000 sailors are killed during these suicide missions. Tinian Island, August the 6th, 1945. Look, Paul, I told myself, this is just another takeoff. You've done it many times before. No sweat. But there was sweat, and I remembered the bombs I carried to Rouen on my first mission over Europe.
When Paul Tibbets prepares to take off for Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, he thinks back to his raid on Rouen. He measures the progress made since 3 years ago, when he'd been this pioneer, alone at the head of 12 planes, who'd carried out the very first raid and opened up a whole new dimension in American bombing. He also measures the progress made since the 1,500 kilos of conventional bombs he'd carried in his hold then, and the now almost 5 tons of bombs, nuclear this time, that he's getting ready to drop on a Japanese city.
What the engineers and the scientists would tell him, okay, Paul, in order to survive the expected blast from these weapons, you need to maneuver the airplane in such a way that you get tangential from the explosion of about 9 miles, so space away from the explosion.
August 6, 1945. Colonel Tibbets takes the Enola Gay down the runway into the air, beginning the 6.5 hour flight to Japan.
August the 6th, 1945 will forever remain the date that marks the beginning of the nuclear age. The most spectacular act of war of the 20th century and the beginning of a new chapter in the book of warfare. A single plane, a single bomb, and in just a few short seconds, the city of Hiroshima is wiped off the face of the earth.
There was a great blinding flash, as if the sun had just fallen out of the sky right in front of my eyes. And the next minute, there was a gigantic blast that threw me to the ground and knocked me unconscious. When I came round after a few minutes, I felt a heavy weight on my body. In fact, the building, the warehouse where I'd been at the time of the explosion, had collapsed, and I was completely buried beneath it. I was injured, but this saved my life because it protected me from the thermal rays. I managed to crawl out from beneath the rubble. And although it was a fine, sunny day, when I emerged from the ruins, I found myself in darkness. On the other side of the bridge, it was now just a sea of deep red flames. People were screaming and running in my direction. Their clothes were on fire. They were burning. I saw several of them climb onto the parapet of the bridge and throw themselves in the river.
When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, 70 years ago, I was in my second year of junior high school. I was 13 years old. When I arrived in the city center at the place where the road was still lined with trees, I saw thousands of people, completely naked, and it was hard to tell whether they were human or not. More and more of them appeared, and they were all headed in our direction. Was it a procession of spirits returned from the dead? Ghosts? Monsters? Demons? Unfortunately, no. There was no doubt about it. They were live human beings. Their skin was bright red because they'd all been burnt. They had their hands stretched out in front of them. Something was hanging down to the ground from the ends of their fingers. It looked like strips of bandages, but it was skin. They all had the same posture and the same appearance. There were thousands of them fleeing the city center, and we, young schoolboys, found ourselves in the middle of these hordes of people. I stared and stared at these strips hanging down from the ends of their fingers, and I was confused, shocked. terrified. It was their own skin that was peeling off and hanging down to the ground. They were holding it delicately in their hands because it must have been extremely painful. They moved very slowly, very carefully, as if in slow motion, away from the center of Hiroshima. They were coming from all sides and we were like surrounded. They advanced very slowly, then dropped to the ground, dead, one after the other. The ones coming up from behind avoided stepping over the bodies and took care to walk around them before falling dead in their turn a little farther on. In the space of a moment, National Route 2 was covered in piles of bodies, but other crowds of completely naked people started to arrive, and it was hard to tell whether they were male or female, adults or children, human beings, monsters or something else. Hiroshima had been transformed into a living hell. That's the atomic bomb. That's war. It's a living hell.
Even now, when I think about it, I still shake.
It's estimated that 80,000 people perished in a single instant. And at the end of 1945, the number of victims rose to over 140,000.
This was how Hiroshima looked after the blast.
While 100 or so Japanese cities had suffered bombardments since the month of January 1945, Hiroshima had been completely left out, ignored.
All the Japanese cities had been turned into infernos. But Hiroshima had strangely been spared.
So there'd been a will to experiment. They'd been careful to preserve the city so as to be able to measure as precisely as possible the destructive power of the atomic bomb.
Paul Tibbets has succeeded in his mission. Upon landing at the American base on Tinian Island, he receives honors and is immediately decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award of the United States Army Air Forces. Congratulated by all, he relates the difficulty of getting out of the blast zone.
Well, as the bomb left the airplane, we took over manual control, made an extremely steep turn to try and put as much distance between ourselves and the explosion as possible. After we felt the explosion hit the airplane, that is the concussion waves, we knew that the bomb had exploded, everything was a success, so we turned around to take a look at it. The sight that greeted our eyes was quite beyond what we had expected, because we saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima.
As my grandfather got older and we started talking about his career, he said, "Paul, and don't miss this, I never lost a night of sleep after that mission. We did the best job we could to carry out the orders that the President of the United States gave us, which we were convinced would lead to bringing the war to an end as quickly as possible."
We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction.
A single bomb was dropped and the big Jap Army base was obliterated, the enemy admitting annihilation. Nagasaki next, The unimaginable power of the atom used to force a quick end to war in the Pacific. Japan to surrender or be destroyed by fleets of atomic bombers.
After the second atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, 3 days after Hiroshima, Japan surrenders. This time it really is the end of the Second World War. The first American troops land on Honshu, Japan's main island, on August the 28th, 1945. The Japanese surrender and disarm. The American contingent would rapidly grow to 500,000 men in order to occupy the entire territory of Japan. On September the 2nd, 1945, in the Bay of Tokyo, representatives of Emperor Hirohito signed the formal surrender documents, the instrument of surrender, aboard the American battleship the USS Missouri. General MacArthur, driven out of the Philippines by the Japanese 3 years earlier, finally has his revenge. It's he who will oversee the American occupation of Japan, which will last until 1952.
At the end of the war, Japan was occupied. It was now occupied Japan. At that time, the General Staff of the occupying army closely supervised the Japanese media. No information unfavorable to the occupying army could be printed, published, or broadcast. For the American army, all information concerning the atomic bombing was considered top secret. Any Japanese citizen who expressed themselves on this subject were arrested and imprisoned, and censorship of the press was established to prevent any discussion on this subject.
After the Hiroshima bombing, the Soviets began seriously considering and working on the development of the atomic bomb. Hiroshima had launched the nuclear arms race.
During and after the American occupation, the victims of the atomic bomb and the radioactivity were hidden away, discriminated against, and forgotten. It's only over half a century later, in 2004, that these victims, these martyrs, who the Japanese call hibakusha, are finally recognized as such. Rare are those who still take an interest in them today. Taiko Kiriya, granddaughter of a hibakusha, is one of the few historians to take an interest in their fate, in their story.
We're here at the memorial that was built to enable people to come and pay tribute to the memory of the Hiroshima bomb victims. Behind me, you have a clock with the time frozen at 8:15, the precise time of the explosion of the bomb. The time at which all the clocks of Hiroshima stopped. For me, this place is a cemetery, because beneath our feet, mounds and mounds of bones are buried. It's maybe hard to imagine now, but after the war, makeshift huts occupied this site for several years. The former inhabitants of the area, as well as other survivors, did what they could to begin a new life for themselves here. But when it was decided that a commemorative park would be built on this site, these people were purely and simply evicted. After August 6, 1945, the hibakusha were left to fend for themselves. After the war, the effects of the radioactivity progressively began to appear, and as there was no information available on the subject, the people started to be afraid of the hibakusha, thinking they were maybe contagious. So a form of segregation began to appear.
The people who'd suffered the effects of the radioactivity left the city to go and live, for example, in Tokyo or Osaka. But we were all looked at as though we had a contagious virus or disease.
It was said that without the atomic bomb, the Americans would have had to engage in ground combat, inevitably resulting in the loss of thousands of young American soldiers. President Truman is going to adopt this myth and considerably amplify it. He declared notably that the use of the atomic bomb had avoided the loss of over 1 million human lives. This statement soon became accepted as reality, but in fact, it's purely a myth. Why was this myth necessary for Truman? It was necessary for the United States because they developed the atomic bomb in order to have it as a weapon of dissuasion and a strategic option. So they now had to justify using it. If they'd recognized the fact that its use constituted a war crime, they wouldn't have been allowed to keep it. But given the international situation and the emerging Cold War, the United States needed to keep this formidable weapon of dissuasion in order to intimidate the Soviets.
Hiroshima is a warning. When we talk anything to do with a nuclear problem now, we use in terms of Hiroshimas. So when we start talking about we have a weapon that can do something, they talk about it, it's equivalent to dropping 5 Hiroshima-sized bombs. Well, that is a very scary calculation. And so that, I think, is a cautionary tale of what happens with those weapons.
In conclusion, I think we can say that Hiroshima and the atomic bomb marked the beginning of the Cold War.